Forward on. All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Ujima Open Wednesday. Here at Ujima, we are building a cooperative business, arts, and investment ecosystem for and by the BIPOC community here in Boston proper. And here on Wednesdays, we focus on financial and political education, which is oftentimes attached to a theme that's related to our community needs raised and uplifted by community. And this month, we are focused on participatory planning, participatory budgeting, and to continue playing on words, we have our guests as an organization, Participatory Budgeting Project, Castania from Participatory Budgeting Project. I'm just getting all tongue twisted now. Who's going to talk to us, share with us the organization, what it does in practice, and kind of share a little bit more about this common theme of participatory efforts and really working from a grassroots perspective to really reach collective goals with community. And so to offer a little bit more, Cristania, welcome. I'm going to take a seat back, try to uplift some questions, and what I'll do, hopefully not to disrupt the conversation, I will also lift some of the chat comments and questions as they come. And so, and I'll try to do that as politely as possible, but welcome.
Thank you so much. That sounds great. I'm going to do my introduction, but I'm just curious if someone's able to give me permission to share my screen in the meantime. I think sometimes the talking can be a lot without some visual support to kind of think about PB in the context there. But hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Cristania De Leon. I use she, her pronouns. Any other pronoun offered respectfully is absolutely fine with me. And I serve as co-executive director with the Participatory Budgeting Project, or PBP. I'm based in Oakland, and I'm really grateful to be here. And our check-in question today was about our 80s go-to songs, like what we jam to. For me, if I want like a real 80s vibe, I've got like a nice Cure medley. That to me is like very 80s feeling. And I think probably Fire and Cairo is my go-to jam. But like upbeat stuff, that can be a spiral. So try to keep it light, rock into the Cure. And today, as Johnny mentioned, we'll be hearing from the participatory budgeting for 2 weeks in a row. So you'll hear from my colleagues next week about some really incredible work that's being led with our Democracy Beyond Elections coalition that PBP is a part of. But today, we're going to focus on participatory budgeting with a very specific centering around justice transformation. And, I think that in Boston, and I'm sure within your coalition, there are a lot of folks who might already be familiar with participatory budgeting. So want to kind of open up the conversation to specifically talk about the ways in which participatory budgeting is used and fits into movements for justice in our communities. I hope we can have sort of like an interactive element to it. So please feel free to use chat. Please feel free to unmute. I'd love to be in conversation about things that we see, but also what do we imagine could be possible? What are ways that these kind of efforts can be complementary and explore some opportunities together? Are you able to see my screen okay? Everything, nothing blocked, all good? Okay, cool. So just a bit about the Participatory Budgeting Project. We were founded in 2009 alongside the first ever participatory budgeting, or PB, process here in the United States. And we've sort of led, supported, researched, and been sort of focused on growing the practice of participatory budgeting across the US and Canada ever since. And with a focus on participatory practice, our sort of mission, our goal is really simple, is to bring the necessary resources to community leaders as they feel is necessary and as they demand, it ties into their efforts for community-led decision-making, to bring those resources so that community members can directly decide together how to spend parts of our public money and how to invest our resources that are shared and that are public among all of us. We work, as I mentioned, primarily in the US and Canada, We have staff in New York City and Oakland primarily. However, our Boston ties run deep on our team. Folks probably are familiar with other members of our team who are natives of Boston, gone to school in Boston, who live in Boston now. And so we're always really excited to connect and really excited to kind of explore some of these concepts together. And so, as I mentioned, next week, you'll hear from others of my colleagues who will talk about participatory policy making and some of the work they're doing in coalition with others to really advance and innovate around these practices. But today we'll dive deep around sort of justice and what that really looks like in this space. So what's participatory budgeting? So, simply put, participatory budgeting is a democratic process in which, as we mentioned, community members work together to directly decide how to spend part of a public budget. I know that there's PB in Boston, and I know there are folks who've probably seen PB happen in other cities as well. So let's talk about how it works. Let's talk about the framework. But I'm really curious actually to hear from folks either in chat or even verbally, when you think about participatory budgeting, are there kind of elements or facets of the work that initially come to mind, things that you're just like, when I think about PB, I think about that voting, or I think about, how we design the process. And I'm just curious, like what do folks really think about when we talk about PB, when we mention it, kind of float it? I'm really curious because I feel like this group probably has a really good handle on some really interesting kind of elements of the work. Awesome. I see collaboration. Yeah, Johnny, do you want to peek in the chat? Just kind of eyeball that for me. Thank you.
Yep.
Definitely, I'd say some form of voting, endorsement, and not just from people who it's their job tied to that budget.
Yeah. Awesome. Anyone else? No pressure.
Yeah, I'll throw in co-creation of projects involving both community members and city staff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Abby has implementable projects, things people can see, like trash cans versus policy.
I love that. And that's actually, I'd love to revisit this, Abby, too, because I think even as a bridge from this week to next week, like that policy component is a really interesting, maybe kind of like vanguard or element of PB that can really be expanded upon. So thank you so much. Awesome. So yeah, I think folks, collaboration, creating things that are really feasible, that vote and thinking about how that shows up across maybe between community members and neighbors, but also between community members and folks who might be representing institutions to really kind of collaborate on what is a vision for investments that we want to see made with our public resources. So generally, as far as the process goes, I'll say this is a framework. PB looks different everywhere because every community is different. But generally speaking, after we set aside a portion of the budget, after we figure out what piece of the budget are we going to be allocating through participatory budgeting, the process really kicks off with what we call is designing the process. So we would convene a community steering committee that's comprised of community members that reflect the demographics of the community. And this is really critical because this is a part of how we can think about kicking off the process with equity kind of baked in. So it should always be the goal for PB to reverse power imbalances as opposed to reinforce them. So you want to think about who comprises this body because they're really critical. This is a body that's charged with serving as sort of the backbone of the process and designing it. They will determine the goals or the principles of the process, the strategies that will be deployed for outreach and engagement, key considerations, and particularly equity and justice considerations like voting, participation eligibility. So who should be allowed to vote? Should there be any restrictions? And this is how we kind of build the foundation for each process and determine, right, if and how and where equity or justice will be kind of baked in and kind of reflected and created for communities. Once the process is designed, members then from the broader community are invited to brainstorm ideas for how the money should be spent. And outreach is done to collect these ideas through a range of community engagement strategies that are really tailored to the needs of any particular community. So for a long time, it's included things like public meetings or assemblies, particularly now, and I think for very obvious pandemic life reasons, there's considerations of like building out online platforms or relying on like SMS text messaging outreach, social media, phone banking, pamphleting, right? It can include really intentional outreach in hospitals, within detention facilities or incarceration facilities, specifically for youth or elders, whatever the community needs to reach as many people as possible and reduce barriers to participation, we really strive to do. During this phase, we'll also kind of figure out, can we get other support to help us, serve in other roles to kind of refine and make some of those feasible projects come together. So we'd also be kind of recruiting for what we typically would call budget delegates. They can have different names in different places. But these delegates then come together and they take all of these incredible ideas that are coming from community, and they take a look at them. They'll turn those initial ideas into really concrete proposals. So they might consolidate some, vet some, prioritize them, and then work with other critical stakeholders that can include other residents with lived experience, not local nonprofits, folks within government or institutions, to work together to really add detail and breathe life into these ideas. So they'll look at need, they'll look at feasibility, equitable impact, other implementation needs, how would we sustain this? And the intention is to be really thorough and really intentional and kind of more on the rigorous side, because we don't want things to move forward. We don't want community voting on things that we can't implement. That's a really big challenge. So we really think about then how we're able to invest in a way and kind of create these proposals that can be successful and implemented impactfully kind of by all accounts. So then those vetted proposals then move on to a ballot, and communities able to vote on the projects that they think are the best projects in accordance with those rules that we designed at the beginning. So when designed for equity, and particularly with a justice lens, it's just important to note that there's no reason why any community members would be inherently ineligible to vote. And this includes those who might be currently or formerly incarcerated, community members across a range of age groups, loved ones who may be undocumented. It's intended to be a platform to be incredibly inclusive. Voting can last days, weeks. The intention is to allow for as many folks to participate as possible, and people can hear about proposals from other community members, learn more about them, what's on this ballot, educate each other, build in relationships as well throughout the process. Then, as you probably expect, projects with the most votes get funded until the pot of money runs out. And then whomever's holding that pot of resources that will be allocated through PB, they release the funds so that we can implement those winning projects. Finally, one thing I'll just note is that participatory budgeting, we hope, is something that folks will do in a cycle and on a regular basis. It's intended to be a new way of including and centering community leaders in how we allocate our budgets. So oftentimes we also then will include a lot of very intentional evaluation, iteration, reflection. How do we improve every single year? And really give ourselves time to make this a really impactful way that we actually decide how we allocate our resources. PB, I think typically if folks are looking to run a process, should usually plan for about a year, especially if it's a first year, to plan it, run it, evaluate it. Proposal development, we probably could guess, tends to take the longest. It can take somewhere around 4 to 5 months to really get the detail we need for those proposals to be really strong, thorough. And we also want to afford ourselves enough time, right? When we do those brainstorming ideas and when we are reaching out to vote, when there's a lot of community engagement, we want a lot of time for deliberation and input. I will say particularly now with American Rescue Plan resources, we've seen folks really pushing for shorter timelines. They're bringing in federal money to respond to really strong immediate needs that communities are having. And so you'll see timeline shifts here and there, but generally speaking, it's a bit about kind of logistics and the framework around this as a practice. I also just want to offer just a few key considerations around PB and what successful PB can look like and some pitfalls that could be good to avoid. And I'm keeping an eye on the chat. I don't see any questions there, but I'll pause momentarily to see if anyone's you lost me at this section, or if there are any other questions about the process overall.
I guess the only question that I would want to throw out there is, for friends of mine who are a little bit outside of the grassroots circle or nonprofit or organizing in general, there's often this stigma around time and process. And so do you anticipate a long-term shift in responding to community need, considering the wake of the pandemic?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that COVID has really elevated, no surprise and kind of uniform across our communities, exacerbating a lot of longstanding inequities. And I think it's surfaced, right, a lot of instances where folks have been facing serious budget deficits, but also getting large influxes of resources from the federal government. People recognizing the disproportionate impact of COVID, and also within the context too. I mean, throughout COVID, we've also seen movements for justice, demands for transparency, equity, and community leadership in decision-making of all kinds. And so, I think that overall, particularly in this last year, there is a huge movement for really strong consideration for, who is most impacted, who should have a say in the decisions that we make. People might look at how CARES Act money was invested and say, we have problems with some of those priorities. Where's our rent relief? Where are these other things that are going to meet our immediate needs? And I do think that's becoming more and more a place for folks to start to make some demands and have some expectations around how government should be moving to meet their particular needs very specifically. See another question.
We have a question from Paige, and I'm just going to lift some of these just for those who are viewing on YouTube or soon to be. How do you ensure the steering committee reflects the broader community demographics? For example, how do you recruit a representative pool of folks to be on the committee?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you for asking. And I'll say people will use different strategies in different kind of contexts. However, generally speaking, if it is sort of a very open and flexible process, sometimes folks have really oriented towards actually doing a really simple application and kind of opening it as broadly as possible to allow for community members to kind of opt in and say, yeah, I'm willing to take this on. And, I think I can kind of bring really important perspectives to this work. Generally speaking, when we talk about representation, it's important to also note that there might be needs to overrepresent for folks who generally are not included in decision-making processes, and to allow ourselves some time to then bring in, leadership from communities that maybe we don't, can be really hard to engage because we don't make it easy. So there are also sometimes instances where people might say, we want this number of people on steering committee, but we're gonna be really clear. We want 2 youth seats. We want a seat for our representative from our local tribe. We want a seat for at least 2 elders. We want to make sure, it might look like that. It might be around geographic representation and say, we're really looking for a community, a steering committee that kind of represents, these communities in some degree of what feels like parity. But generally speaking, we also encourage to, like, in terms of who reviews those applications, who's able to do that outreach to identify those members, to really, encourage folks to think about the role of community also in being able to elect who represents them in this process as well. And that's something that we see work pretty effectively.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, I was curious if you could talk a little bit about where maybe give a couple examples of communities where you feel like participatory budgeting has worked particularly well, and what were the keys to that success?
Yeah, I'm gonna pause on that, Steve, because we're gonna talk about a couple of case studies, and I think we'll lift up some there. And I think the next couple of slides will also lift up just some key considerations and maybe pitfalls to avoid, and like the kinds of things that tend to work better than others. And then let's check back in and see if there's a couple of other questions where maybe we haven't quite hit on and responding to all the things you might be wondering about. Is that okay?
Okay.
Awesome. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you for those questions, and we can kind of keep them rolling for sure. I do want to just emphasize a couple of key things about participatory budgeting I think are really important. And the first is that, PB is a framework, which means that, if we kind of walk through the steps and like check all the boxes, we might be able to really yield some more transparent and more democratic decision-making, but it doesn't guarantee that the process will be equitable, will be deeply inclusive, and really have sort of a perspective that we feel really meets the needs that we're trying to really meet through our process. So generally speaking, when we think about PB, it's important to remember that it should always be rooted in real decision making. That we're not talking about a community consultation or a one-time kind of like survey. We're really talking about a deliberative, intentional process for direct decision making. What wins a vote is funded. Community voices are honored, and they're really heard and felt. The other is that it is typically applied to a portion of a budget, not necessarily a whole budget, but hopefully is sort of an amount of resources that corresponds with money that people care about, a significant per capita or total amount, so that folks want to take the time to be involved. And they feel as though the outcomes of the process are felt, are impactful to them. And that's a piece of what we recognize around equity and some considerations for success. We want to make sure that this will have impact and really honor the time that it takes for community to be involved. But we also have to really consider, how are we centering grassroots leadership? What does that look like? Are we designing very intentionally for an inclusive process? What does that look like? Do we have the resources and the staff time to make it happen? Are we really naming the outreach we need to happen for this to be a successful process? And as opposed to saying like impacted community, maybe we need to be really specific. And really what we mean is, Black residents living in this community who experience these things. Maybe we need to then build that into how we specifically build our process, and then name how equity shows up. Build it into our criteria, build it into our processes and approach. The intention we bring, the lens we bring, if we want a decolonial practice that's built in, we've got to bring that to the process. That's really important. Sometimes we think about success, Steve, around like pitfalls and challenges. One of the things can be capacity. One, do we have resources to stipend and pay folks for their time to really kind of create that strong relationship and collaboration? And if we're working with an institution that might be holding their resources, like a city, for example, do they have the staff capacity to offer that like project management or wraparound support, the support to get other folks to help us and collaborate with us around proposal development and things like that? Are all really important considerations. And so sometimes, those like challenges or things that can kind of undermine some of this work are usually associated with like limited investment in kind of all of these areas of the process. And just want to emphasize how important this is for really good PB. And then finally, I think there are generally questions of like, what kinds of budgets? What are we talking about? What does this really work with? I just want to emphasize, PB is really nimble. It's really flexible. It can work with a range of budgets. So we'll see PB with very loose discretionary resources, sometimes with funding for very particular purposes, like for housing or for transportation. We might be looking at budgets that have sort of an orientation around serving particular needs for certain populations. Nonprofits run PB. All nonprofits might have the opportunity to think about how do we bring this into our internal budgets as well. PBP does this, and we have a number of partners who also do. But of course, and I think in the context of justice, funds that are divested from police and carceral systems are big examples of how we see the sort of this intersection of participatory budgeting and justice, which I want to talk about with everyone and offer some examples of how that's looked, and then talk together about how some of these can kind of play out. So like pivoting towards examples of participatory justice, the first thing I want to just acknowledge is that we can tend to use a lot of terminology and kind of very specific kinds of nomenclature for participatory budgeting work. So I just want to acknowledge that participatory justice, I don't think is sort of a universally accepted way to describe what we're talking about here today, but it is something that the Participatory Budgeting Project has been using to really talk about specific applications of participatory budgeting. Because like, a PB process, we want to talk about things that are rooted in participatory democracy and decision-making, but we're also, wanting to talk very specifically to sort of a justice process that's looking at direct decision-making by communities who are most impacted by very specific things, right? Overcriminalization, policing, legal or carceral systems, surveillance, racially and socially determined justice, and in the ways that people experience injustice in our communities. So this area of work, at least at PBP, is really concerned with how do we experience, how do we define, How do we dismantle and build and expand together what justice actually looks like in our everyday lives? And recognize this can be very much more than just budgets. And there are a lot of pieces at play here, but want to offer some examples and think together about how this kind of look in practice and some successes that we see in bringing participatory budgeting and participatory practice specifically to this kind of justice space. I'm going to speak through this first one just to share a little bit more about how this looks and some great highlights of success, but want to work together actually to name a couple of opportunities for some other kind of bigger examples as well. So one area that we see a lot of growth in participatory budgeting with this justice lens is within schools. So this looks different in different contexts. One really great and exciting example is some of the work that's been done in Brooklyn, kind of under the banner of Safe Schools, where students were able to decide and make both budget investments, but also name policies that they would like to change to increase safety on their campuses. And this was resourced through the Brooklyn Borough President's Office and was a way to then invest in a couple of campuses at a time for each cycle to allow them to really have students decide how to create cohesion in their community and kind of define safety together. Phoenix Union High School District is another example of how this is looked in schools. Their district decided not to renew their contract with their school resource officers, who are typically paid and contracted armed officers who are on their campuses, and instead say, as we remove this kind of traditional representation of safety, what do we build in its place? If we're not going to renew this contract, then how do we invest in opportunities for some shared decision making about, well, what really does bring safety to our schools and our school districts? So they've been running participatory budgeting with the resources that would have otherwise gone to those school resource officers. They've been able to work together to do some needs assessment and work together through PB processes that center students, a process that centers their guardians and loved ones, and then school staff to determine together what is school safety for us and how do we move forward in allocating resources and investments appropriately. I'd love to hear from all of you around some examples of maybe that could come to mind around cannabis legalization as a piece for our movements and movement buildings for justice. What could it look like and what comes to mind for folks when we think about the ways that participatory budgeting could be deepening, supporting, and sort of integrating with movements around cannabis legalization?
I guess to get it started, because I'm sure folks have tons of ideas. Opening up dispensary, particularly the workforce development in that area, to those with Corey backgrounds, possibly extended Corey backgrounds, where it's the decision to hire is based, is a case-by-case basis versus this uniform prescribed approach to not offer opportunities. When we know the war on drugs was very much targeted on certain communities. And so, you know, I'll just leave it there.
Absolutely. How about others?
Maybe, this is Paige, some kind of grant to support small business owners who work in the cannabis industry of color. So folks who have been historically criminalized for being a part of the cannabis industry informally, maybe providing some grants to help new business owners in that space, in that background.
Absolutely. Awesome. So some things that we see sort of in this space in particular are looking at a couple of different things. So sometimes when legalizing cannabis is going to bring in tax revenue, so maybe we'll legalize it and then we'll tax it. There are a lot of questions about who decides how that revenue is invested and what are the outcomes of those potential investments. So can we talk about something that can look like repair in communities that are really impacted by the war on drugs and have been over-criminalized around cannabis use. There are a lot of questions around, can we create incentives for equity in those cannabis industries? Absolutely. As industries grow, they tend to skew in terms of ownership and profit off as industry white, they tend to skew male. And most folks who might, otherwise be able to be a part of a legal industry are blocked from that because they may have had a record or because of that over-criminalization. How do we really think about equity in that process? And how do we kind of build in the infrastructure and support that we need? The other thing that comes up a lot is around record expungement. If we're going to legalize cannabis and expunge people's records, can PB be run with some of those revenues to focus on a just transition, to really focus on supporting and building the infrastructure that folks might need as they reunite with their families and become sort of incorporated into their communities again? What does that look like? And sort of how can these work in tandem? Great examples. Thank you so much. The next one I love to kind of get some of your perspectives around are justice movements that are focused on police divestment. I'm really curious what comes to mind for folks when they think about the ways that participatory budgeting in particular kind of plays into this movement for defunding police or some divestment from harmful systems.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think PB makes a lot of sense in the face of defunding, because part of what you have to think about is community co-creation of safety. So if the community is actually defining where the resources are going, whether it's sports leagues or dance clubs or whatever it is, that's creating activity and value, that's more likely to be effective, in addition to actually, having community input on the projects themselves.
Absolutely. Any other reflections on how this can these kind of elements can intersect at all? Yeah, Steve, I think you've really captured a lot of it. When we talk about defunding police, what typically folks will hear is less money for police, and it can kind of create different kinds of reactions based on people's kind of ideas or opinions around that. But what's really integrated into this process and this idea is we're defunding police, but we're also investing in community, right? That money's going somewhere. So we typically talk about this as happening within a divest invest framework, where yes, there's divestment, but there also needs to be investment. And there are a lot of questions about then who's trusted to make those investments? Who knows the most about what folks need? Do we trust folks who kind of feel like the status quo is okay to then decide where money goes and how and what's going to be funded with some of these resources? And also considerations around how do we address alternatives to policing, but also can we invest those resources in a way that also address root causes of poverty, root causes of violence, in a myriad of ways that feel supportive and life affirming for members of our communities. One great example of sort of a campaign to really advance this conversation and a big win in this space is in Seattle. They were able to secure $30 million for a PB process that's really focused specifically on racial justice. 12 million of that 30 million is divested from their police. And so that process is set to launch early next year. So keep an eye out for it. It's a significant amount of resources that are being invested through participatory budgeting. And there are a lot of amazing things that they've been able to do in their campaign to get this win. So we'll encourage folks to check out King County Equity Now. I think that photo that I saw earlier was from them. Decriminalize Seattle. And we'll also name that one of the early things that they were able to do in divestment was to secure some early resources, $3 million that came from their police budget to fund research. So they were able to hire researchers from within the Black community who are actually really struggling through COVID, offer some paid opportunities, and actually allow the community to name, when we talk about this $30 million process and some divestment, we're talking about investments that we want to see made in some key particular areas. So this research also yielded some recommendations for how the PB money, some of this divested resources should be invested. And in that research project also named housing and physical space. They want investments in mental health that's culturally responsive and centered around care. They want to see investments in youth and children, particularly if it can support intergenerational support, and that's sort of outside of school settings, but really build some cohesive support in that respect. Economic development, particularly looking at COVID, but also long-standing inequities, and crisis and wellness support. How do we build those alternatives to 911 response and other things that people need and are asking for? Looking at time, I think we have time for maybe just 2 more quick ones, and then I want to offer some resources as well. But I'm curious if anyone has a perspective on like how participatory budgeting then also intersects with movements for looking at our carceral system and particularly around jail closures.
Just wanted to lift, this was in the chat from Siona, so helpful to learn about PB, especially with benefits to our communities. Just wanted to lift that.
It's all good if there are no initial thoughts, but I want to give folks another moment if you're thinking about anything that feels particularly of interest or resonant around like participatory budgeting in like some justice of context around closing jails or other kinds of facilities. Go for it.
Well, I think the only thing for me is the ongoing discussion about what happens to that workforce and how would they reinvest it, particularly their time, their hour, and their labor, and what are opportunities that are being created for that existing workforce. I've been stuck in those conversations, kind of like not necessarily having an answer. So it'd be great to hear some thoughts around that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, increasingly folks' demands for justice, particularly racial justice, have really looked at not just policing, but also bigger systems at play. And jail closures in the carceral system are absolutely a piece of that. And so you'll see kind of in the background here, this is an example from the Close the Workhouse campaign in St. Louis. And there are other examples where folks are saying, look, they're not using these facilities as they used to. These are deeply harmful to our communities. We need to think about how we reinvest and create a system and a process of care and really meeting community need. So oftentimes jail closures open up conversations that can be community-led about if we have overhead costs and operating expenses that are no longer being utilized to operate these facilities, should there be an opportunity then for community members, impacted community, to decide how to invest those resources into communities and meet their needs? That can include, right, if those communities and folks who might be out of work or affected by a workforce transition, a part of what those investments could be. And there could be another space where reparations and other kinds of needs are often brought up, specifically around some of these freed up resources. This also brings into kind of question and opportunities to talk about other kinds of resources for community leadership. So what do we do with the land? What do we do with the facilities? Who decides what now exists here? And that's become a really important kind of expansion of the conversation about how they intersect. In Los Angeles, the Men's Central Jail closure campaign in their process has put forward a recommendation for participatory budgeting, again, with some of those overhead expenses that are no longer going to be used to operate that facility, but also included some community outreach and idea collection, much like in PB, to ask community members, what do you want to see here? And it ranges all kinds of things, from parks to community gardens to a place where we can access certain services, and really imagining what that can be and look like. And with those kinds of resources that can be allocated and reclaimed by impacted community. The last thing I just want to mention, because I think is really important, and I think particularly in Boston, but many other places, are just the sort of movements around people's budgets. What could happen when community members can take surveys and actually say, hey, if I could kind of allocate some of these resources, my budget might look very different than our budget does now. And, you know, it's been a really useful, I think, process for lots of folks in campaigns to really think about how do we use some people's budget survey data for our advocacy to show where things are really off the mark. How do we use that as sort of data that we can use that might be somewhat more empirical to kind of reinforce our demands for investments that might be made elsewhere through participatory budgeting. It's also a process where folks can do some budget education, budget literacy. Not everyone gets to, like, budgets that can be really inaccessible. And sometimes people are like, what are the departments that get funding in a budget? And people feel like, I have no idea. So I do think that there are oftentimes, you know, instances where people's budgets and their surveys can be ways for folks to then learn more about the department and how they might recommend some shifts, and then can be really powerful platforms to then build a campaign around justice-centered participatory budgeting. I'm going to put the link to the Boston People's Budget Survey in the chat. I think it's launched semi-recently within the last month, and encourage folks to take a look at it, fill it out, and see what other folks in your community actually think about, you know, your current spending, and if that could yield sort of more equitable outcomes based on what folks really would like to see as folks impacted in the community. So I want to leave folks with some resources and acknowledge that in all of these kinds of campaigns, PB is usually one, not the only demand. It's just one tool of a myriad of tools and strategies and tactics, but it's sort of increasingly demonstrated as a really strong example of how we can use our advocacy and use our budgets in particular to transform, build, you know, the communities, the relationships, institutions that we believe really support a vision for true justice that can affect all of us. So just a couple of resources to leave folks with that could be of interest. Sherry's joined us. I want to let folks know Sherry has a really great TED Talk if you want folks to learn more about participatory budgeting, but also in the framework of thinking big, imagining big. And as we talk about rebuilding, after we dismantle these harmful systems, how do we kind of infuse that energy into our work? So definitely want to encourage folks to share and view this TED Talk. I think it's great priming for that thinking big and that radical imagination that we're going to need to create those just communities. Last summer, and I'm going to throw that link into the chat. Last summer, we did a series of information sessions focused specifically on visions for justice. All the examples I showed, and Steve, I would say like the best examples of each of these kinds of processes are featured in that blog series. So we have blogs and we have recordings, and you'll get to hear directly from folks who are involved in the Close the Workhouse campaign, the work in Seattle, some work in Safe Schools and other places as well. So that link is also in the chat. And then finally, I just want to encourage folks, because you'll hear from some of my colleagues who talk about participatory policymaking next week. Check out democracybeyondelections.org. This is a campaign that we're collaboratively convening to really push the needle on participatory practice, not just in our budgets, but in a range of policymaking spaces. So get excited, check out their website. You'll hear more from them next week and learn more about the really incredible work they're doing alongside some of our partners. And in the meantime, if you have additional questions or want to know more about participatory budgeting, feel free to reach out to me, Kristania at participatorybudgeting.org. Thank you so much for having me. And then I can also include a couple of recommendations for other kinds of processes that could be really stellar examples of PB in your community. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for attending. Thanks so much for our members who are here in this space as well. And thanks for those who tuned in on the YouTube channel. So we'll say a quick bye before we actually do a final bye in this space. So see ya.